Okay, hi. Well, thank you, Darkman. Applause for Darkman for that amazing intro.
We love
Making
you.
everything run. So this is sort of the Games Job speedrunning panel. We kind of submitted this with a lot of details about it, but the idea of this panel is we're going to talk about how speedrunning relates to the games industry and how it affects us in our kind of day-to-day lives. And we are game developers from very different disciplines. So I'd say let's go ahead and do a left to right where we can say what we do, where we do it, and
why
say our name.
Hi, I'm Cameron. Some of you might know me as MunchaKoopas. I speedrun Shovel Knight, and I also work at Yacht Club Games as a quality assurance tester. I also did some level design and puzzle design for King of Cards.
My name is Chris, or BIGHONKINBURGER, or Live Studio Audience. I work for ZeniMax Online Studios as a producer. ZeniMax Online Studios makes Elder Scrolls Online, and I'll pass it off.
Hi, yes, I'm Dylan Snyder. I'm a combat designer slash wearer of many hats and hearts. Got a big heart. At Gunfire Games in Austin, Texas, I've worked on Darksiders 3, Remnant from the Ashes, and then before that I was at NetherRealm, worked on Mortal Kombat, Injustice, all that good stuff.
Yeah. And so to go a bit more into depth, like we're going to talk about our roles and how our roles kind of interact with like speedrunning or even just kind of the habits of it, and then kind of go into how we got into the industry, and then from there, you know, broader stories and questions and all the fun side stuff that panels always have. Feel free to interject anybody, just because I'll be talking a lot. So in my case, as a producer, it is my job to essentially get things done, which is kind of this very, very vague sort of non-thing when you think about it, because I don't code, I don't design, I don't art. My handwriting is terrible, but it is my job to lead meetings, for example. It's like, hey, we got this task to get this thing done, and it's my job to get the requirements, hand those requirements out to different teams, make sure their questions are being answered, make sure kind of everything is always moving, and the things that are moving are the most important things. Because if you think about a game, every game has just tons of smaller components, and those all have to be built out by hand, or you have to build out a system that lets you not build them out by hand. And even the ones that get built by hand have to get verified by QA and just, you know, checked in some sort of way. So it is my job to just kind of facilitate that process. So a lot of it ends up being just very simple things. Like I have to schedule meetings, I have to take meeting notes, to broader things where I get told by a product manager, hey, I want to do these things, can you check in with these teams and see what this will be like? And then which ends up with me running around asking a bunch of questions, to facilitating releases and making sure the right stuff is going out. So producer, it's one of those job titles that will change company to company within the games industry, because a producer at EA, for example, is closer to a product manager that will like come up and design things and like run lots of experience themselves, versus a producer at one of my old companies where they essentially ran the entire economies of the game themselves, but that is not how I've seen it run anywhere else. So it's kind of like a weird non-title. And so just to kind of connect to speedrunning now, is one of the biggest things about speedrunning is repeatability. Is everything you do in a speedrun has to be doable multiple times. You have to be able to perform it multiple times, whether it is by chance or whether it is just some consistent route. And this leads to a lot of predictability. So one part of my role is risk assessment, is to look at a thing, go, hey, how much will this blow up in our faces if we try and do this? And if you think about a speedrun that is constantly measuring risk assessment, you're constantly going, do I go for this harder trick? Do I go for this time saver that looks really cool but only saves half a second? I have a 90% chance of failing, and the answer is yes, you do it every time. Or do I go for this kind of sort of stable thing that like I know it will work, it should work, things can go wrong, I could mess up, but like that planning and sort of, you know, familiarity will get me through that. And so that's one of those things I took from just doing runs myself, because I've run a billion indie games is what I'll narrow it down to. And every time it's just like, well, there's this section going up, there's a boss fight coming up, I'm low on HP, do I care about the risk now? If I fail here, is it, like, if I succeed with a lower time, is that worth it? Or should I just go for the risky strat and the likely failure? Because right now I'm not in a valid enough state of a run where I care about failure that much. And if you think about how the work ends up being for me, it ends up being a lot of, I don't know if you guys have dealt with this before, but going, well, we can mess up, but the mess ups aren't that bad, or the mess ups are just kind of okay.
That's somewhat my experience in QA. I mean, yeah. If I mess up, everybody has a bad time.
That's true.
I guess I'll go next. I got into like the game industry through speedrunning, obviously, because I work for the company that made the game that I speedrun. And they found out about me through GDQ. I initially started out working remotely for them, and then I had the opportunity to move in 2017, and so now I work in office. I test on like 13 different platforms. I know like a ton of different certification requirements for various publishers, etc. I don't like the 3DS. I'll just throw that out there. But as far as how speedrunning relates to it, I mean, speedrunning is essentially breaking a game, but not to the same extent, because you're working with a finished product as opposed to testing, which is often a product that is still in progress, where almost anything can break at any time. And depending on how that game is structured, if you're testing like a sequel of a game that's been built off of a previous game, you're probably reusing assets. And that means that if you change something on the stuff you're currently working on, that might break something in stuff you had already released. And so like in Shovel Knight's case, I am constantly going back and forth between new content and old content to try and make sure that nothing we've implemented has broken what has already been out. Unfortunately, since everything is connected with bubblegum and paper clips, everything breaks all the time. But, I mean, that's another story. But speedrunning and QA is very similar because you're looking for, like speedrunning, you're looking for a time save. You're looking for how do I get around or through, in some cases, what has been presented to me. How do I save the most time? Or how do I push a game's physics to its limit? How do I use all of my character's abilities and tools to their fullest extent? And QA kind of turns that on its head, where instead of looking for a time save, you're trying to pick apart like the logic of a system and figure out where the holes are in that logic. So a good example is like, say you enter a dialogue option and that takes away the player's ability to input permanently aside from advancing text. What you're then looking for is there anything the player can do at that point where they shouldn't be able to input anything, where they can input things? Because as it turns out, being able to input during cutscenes or dialogue causes a lot of problems, as you could imagine. But yeah, that's kind of how speedrunning and QA relate. It's a very, very close ratio, I'd say. Oh.
So in design, it is basically my job to drive both QA and production insane. We send lots of broken things to QA, and then we don't follow up on those broken things nearly enough to satisfy production. And so I cherish the emails I get saying, hey, check your JIRA, you haven't in like 2 weeks, you jerk. But no, it's funny. Design is very much a sort of a funnel. You start very broad, and then you whittle down to very specific by the end. So in the beginning, you're having a lot of kind of overarching meetings about what are the goalposts, what are the where do we want to end up, and kind of what is our timeline to do that. So how much can we kind of really mess around and find the fun, as it were. Sometimes those deadlines are very, very small, so you don't have a lot of time to find the fun. But for myself personally, I got into to sort of tie it to speedrunning. I actually have just been a big fan of speedruns for a long time. I've been watching GDQ for like 6 or 7 years now. 6. Yeah, 6. And this is actually my first time attending the conference itself, which is really, really cool. But in recent years, I'm actually working on games that are kind of viable as speed games. So Darksiders and Remnant both have their own quirks, but they've been speedrun. I've watched speedruns of them. That's kind of wild.
I've done a Remnant speedrun.
Yeah. You've told me. Lots of fun things.
Watch my runs. They're good.
Yeah, I believe in you, man. You're great in general. But yeah, so it's kind of come full circle for me. And I've attempted speedrunning once in my life. I tried Shovel Knight for a few months, and I was doing it while racing a friend. We were both learning it, and in the first actual race we ever tried, I think he was done in an hour something, and I was still on Plague Knight, and I gave up. I was like, I don't know if this is happening. So, but yeah, it's design is kind of all the things you've ever heard, and that it's people throwing ideas and seeing what sticks. But it's also surprisingly ends up being a very kind of technical process at the end of the day. We're not engineers, so we rarely are touching code to that extent, but you do kind of need to understand it to be able to have these discussions. And you need to basically understand, at least to some extent, every discipline so that you can communicate effectively, because you're always working with every discipline. So yeah, design it's an interesting hybrid.
situation.
Yeah, it's not, you don't just walk into a room and go like, let's do this cool video game idea I have for like my personal game. It's always like, hey, here are the business goals and here's the time. I'm just going to fire them at you rapid fire. Heck, we need an idea really soon because the timeline's too short. Can we meet back in 30 minutes?
Yeah.
I'll have a bunch of Jira tickets made that are blank and ready to be filled out, and we'll just go ahead and go through that one by one, and now we're going to make a game.
How can we make something not soulless and get content out in like 3 weeks? Is
Sorry,
that how?
we don't have a timeline that supports not soulless.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
semi-soulless. Then.
Yeah. To add into how I got into games, so I used to be a GDQ staff member actually, and that was sort of games adjacent. Games are actually very interesting in that depending on where you work, most places kind of, like you'll hear this a lot, is once you get into games, it's easier to get a different job in games, which is true, but like games adjacent is really not the same as games. So despite working at events, and it's not actually working on a game, and it was fairly tough getting out of, or not getting out of, but using Games and Quick as a platform until I met someone who liked League of Legends, and I did a lot of League of Legends stuff back in 2012, and then liked Games and Quick. So I sent, he was a Something Awful forums poster and had posted that there was a production opening at his company. And I sent like the most nonchalant, because I didn't really know his company, I didn't really like know anything about the guy, just like, hey, yeah, I can probably apply to that. I have like this experience at Games on Quick and doing stuff for League of Legends as a community person. And they just sent me a message back immediately, like, you should apply right now. And then I got a job because I messaged somebody on a forum. And then I got more jobs after I decided to leave that company. And it was very much just like, yeah, that was a weird route, and I don't think it works for anybody. I don't think joining a forum and messaging game devs on it is going to be a reliable 100% of the time. But it is one of those things where once you find that opening, and quite often it is going to be because you make some weird connection. For example, you speedrun the game that you're working on, or that they're working on, and they notice you because you're playing it for like 100,000 people. That is a pretty unique way to get noticed.
It is. Similarly, another project I work on called Heartforth Elysia, I did basically the same thing Studio did. The developer was streaming pixel art that he was doing in his stream. This was back in 2015. The game's still in progress. But this was right after my first GDQ appearance, and I just popped in his chat and said, oh, hey, I missed the Kickstarter. I really like your game. If you ever need additional testing, let me know. I'd be happy to help you for free. Because at the time, I had never done any official QA. I had just done like some basic feedback for Yacht Club on their upcoming content. And so I was half joking when I said, hey, I'll work for free if you need extra help. I expected a no, like, oh, no, thank you. I'm good. I have what I need. And he was like, wait, MunchaKoopas. Oh, I watched you run. You're cool. Yeah, I'd love to have you aboard. Let's talk after my stream. And I was like, that wasn't supposed to work. But it did, and now I'm doing that too, so it's fun.
Yeah, it's funny because it does end up a lot of the time being knowing somebody, but at the same time, that person knowing somebody or someone who knows someone, like that will likely get you in the door, get you noticed in a sense, or get a resume in front of someone who matters. But at the end of the day, you need to have some sort of skills to bring to the table. Like just saying, for example, for you, if it was like, oh, I sure love Shovel Knight, but that's it. I don't play it endlessly and find all these exploits and stuff like that. It would have been a very different conversation, I imagine.
Just quickly for reference, every discipline usually has some sort of test in game dev. I don't know about production.
Production's the weirdest one. I'll let you finish because production's super
I just wasn't sure. So basically, for the QA test, I can't go into very specific details about it, but there is a QA test. I currently have the highest score on said QA test, and I beat my current lead at it, which he has like many years of experience, and I've never done this before. But yeah, they just sent me something like, this build is full of obvious bugs. Please send them back. All right, here's 50. There were only 30. What were you doing?
Production is great because there is no, like, I made sure that production was seen as a nebulous thing, and because every company is different, the production tests end up being just conversations. Like, usually it's just part of the interview where you describe situations you've been in, but it ends up being like you describe a situation you've been in, somebody catches something that they didn't like about that, and you just go into great, really nebulous and weird details about just like, yeah, here was a problem we had at my old company. It's like, okay, how'd you resolve it? Well, I did this. Okay, what if this guy had said this thing instead? This is what I would have said to this other guy. And it ends up being just like a lot of like, how can you relate to people? And like a lot of basic assumptions like, hey, will you come to work on time? And will you fill out Jira tickets if asked to? Yes, okay, we don't care about that. But that's because production ends up being very, very people-oriented. So knowing how to manage relationships ends up being super important. And that's something that you can't really test on. You can't have a paper form of just like, would you be a mean person? Yes, and I would not listen to anybody. Like, you can't test that easily. Or you can, it's just going to be the worst test ever, because I will always get it right, because I'll be a very nice and friendly but kind of stern person.
You've thought this out.
I've talked to many producers many times, and every conversation is the exact same when it comes to testing.
Yeah, it's kind of going back to what you mentioned just about how you beat your lead at the QA test. A lot of the times you will end up seeing, developers have a wide range of gaming skills, like the ability to actually play the games that they're making. Accusation that gets leveled a lot at game developers is, like they must be the best, and if they at all show weakness and not, an ability to not be able to be the best at their game that they made, it somehow makes them inferior developers. But by that same token, the CEO of my studio is actually, like he programs, he designs, he knows art, he knows everything. He's amazing. He's a workhorse. But he will be the first one to send you an email. I had a boss fight that just recently that I submitted for feedback, and his response back was, "I personally can't beat this boss, but I'm sure that and our gameplay lead, who's amazing at all things, he's like, I'm sure that he could beat it, no hit, one shot, without even looking." It's at the end of the day, it's a wide range of experiences and kind of interactions with games that everybody's had in their lives. That it doesn't necessarily mean you're the best at making, at getting high scores at the games that you make, but you can still have the design sense to understand, what the people who do get those scores want out of the game that you're making. So it's a very interesting balance to strike.
Yeah, I'd actually say it's interesting in that I've seen the opposite problem many times, where people just don't play the games they work on often. And this happens a lot when people are in a field that aren't tied to the game as much in terms of gameplay. So if you're an artist, you do want to see how something moves and how something flows. But I've seen artists where they've worked on the same game for, I'm going to use World of Warcraft as an example. If you worked on the game for 15 years, you may have gotten bored of it, and so people may not be playing the game as much as you would normally expect a game developer to play. And it's actually kind of different studios have different ways of solving this, but it's a thing where it is work to a degree. And so I'd actually say quite often game developers might even be a little bit worse, just as over time they distance themselves from the product in a way that other people won't, because most people will not go, well, this is work to me, so I'm going to treat it like work. They'll go, this is a video game that I want to play. It's a very odd problem that definitely pops up. And you have to kind of force people to sit down, enjoy this. Yeah, it's work. Yeah, it's something you've done a bunch of times, but you can still have fun with this, and you gotta stay familiar.
Yeah, one of our artists at work actually, he always asks me for help with where stuff is in the game, or trying to beat a certain boss. So again, going back to everybody has a different level of skill, and you'll find that many different people have many different skill sets that might not pertain specifically to their skill set. I'm not an artist. I know nothing of drawing or pixel art, etc. But I'm still happy to work with the art team and say, hey, this actually happened. Someone drew a character, and I'm like, this character's head doesn't look like it's physically attached to their spine. And 5 minutes later, they're like, oh,
might be a
you're
red
right.
flag.
But just going back to skills you wouldn't think that people have. I'm going to toot my own horn here. I'm very bad at words. Anyway.
Same.
When testing a recent project, I can't discuss in great detail, but I was watching myself play this game, and I noticed that every time I would hit an object or an enemy with my weapon, the game would hitch for exactly 1 frame. And no one would believe me until I got a high capture video and slowed it down and said, here it is. It's slowing down every time I attack. So that was weird. Another one is one of our pixel artists, he'll be 10 feet away from you, walking away to go to lunch or something. You'll just be going through a room, and he'll come back in the room and say, wait, go back 3 rooms. Okay, go back over there. That pixel's gray. It should be green. I'll go fix it. You were over there. Yeah, that is the case, though, where the designers especially are very good at the games they make. And that usually tends to, I don't know if that's the case at other studios, but at least at Yacht Club, the case is the designers are honestly usually better than me at most things, except the boss fights. No one can beat me at those.
I mean, that's gonna be a fun challenge where if you have to design something that's easier than what you play at, and you're always playing at the best level because you play it so much.
It happens all the time. It like constantly. I remember on a boss very recently that I was working on, and it's funny, these things get drawn out. It's not like a 2-week turnaround on any of this stuff, right? It's like, for a mini boss, for example, it's like a month and a half. For a world boss, it's 3 months. So you're looking at this stuff for a huge period of time. But yeah, on a boss recently, me and one of the chief animators that was working with me on it, we played this fight like 200 times a day for weeks and weeks. I remember him coming up to me. He's like, "Man, I'm thinking it's a little too easy." He's like, I feel like I never have to heal. I don't have to do any of this stuff." And we're like, "Yeah, I think I'm feeling the same way. This is crazy." And then we started putting it in front of people. And we had people coming back to me like, "I can't beat this. I keep dying. What the hell's wrong with you? Like, you fools, you're destroying us." And so that was kind of, in a weird way, vindication that, okay, cool. So the boss is hurting people a little bit. But also, yeah, we have to look at this again.
Yeah, that's also a nice thing about having a speedrunner as a QA tester is the design team gets they get someone that's very good at the game to determine whether or not something is too hard. And it's honestly better to have someone who's never played your game before test a new boss or feature to see if it's too difficult or clear in its description. But it is nice when they make something and then I say, "Hey, I've been trying for an hour. I can't get past the second phase or whatever," and they'll adjust it accordingly. So I'm not sure how valuable that is. It seems valuable to me.
It's all valuable. It ends up, there's so many occasions where you'll submit something for review and feedback. You put it in front of a bunch of people, and you'll be expecting, feedback on this subset of things. Right? You submit your work, and you're like, "Okay, I'm kind of worried about this attack. I don't know if that reads well enough, or I don't think that he has enough health." And I'm expecting people to give me feedback on that. And then when you get the feedback back, no one says a word about any of that stuff, and you get stuff like, "When we walk through the door, I don't even know where he is in the room. So I don't even start fighting him for 40 seconds. And I can't, he just doesn't know where I am. I don't know where he is." And it's like, "Oh, yeah, okay, fair enough." It's, all of that feedback that goes into, you wouldn't think about, but it goes into making convincing and compelling content. It takes a lot of eyes to see that stuff. And nothing is too dumb. Well, that's not true. There's some stuff that's too dumb to talk about, but most feedback is useful. So.
I do like the idea of just "Oh yeah, boss needs to be in front of player or player can't fight boss." It's as a little note.
God, every day. No joke. People send that feedback every day. Outsource QA or something you'll get back. It's like, "Boss is not fun." It's like, thank you. What?
Well, it's so I've done mobile stuff at my older company, Machine Zone, and it was fun there because one of the biggest things they had was a tutorial, and I didn't really think about why is so much effort being put into this. And mobile's a crazy case because people will pick up a game for a minute or two, and they may have never played a mobile game before or just have no concept of understanding for it. So they were constantly testing and just seeing "Hey, how do we make sure people know that you can drag this thing here or click this button here? It's a big button, labeled button that you can click," and it's just "Yeah, but people have never seen a button like this before possibly, so we need to make sure they can see and click that button."
My favorite bugs are the ones where there's a video attached to the bug, and you click it, and it's someone filming with their phone the screen as the thing has happened, and you just see a finger appear on screen going, and that's it. And you read back, and you're like, nothing in the bug actually states what they're pointing at. What is this?
That's always the best, especially if it comes from your support email or social media, because you never see the video that led up to the bug.
No.
You just see, "Hey, my character is stuck doing this thing."
It's always the 10 seconds after.
Cool, great. You could have done 4 billion different things in the 4 hours you were playing.
It's
I'll get right on that.
Thank you for telling us, and we're incredibly sad now.
Yeah.
And we're going to do nothing about this because we don't know what
This is
you
going to
did
keep me up
or
at
how
night.
you did it, but we're going to be fully aware that we're doing it and feel bad.
Yep.
A quick anecdote about that. There was a crash in Shovel Knight after we did our most recent launch, and I had to figure out what exactly was causing it. And it took me 2 days of work time to figure out an exact 16-step process down to when you pressed enter on your keyboard at a specific time. That was a pain.
So that actually leads to what I think is we're gonna have a myth busting segment, I guess, which is when people say it's "Oh man," you see speedrunners say this, and somebody will probably say this once at the marathon and will be annoyed. where they say something like, I can't believe QA didn't find this weird thing. Because I feel like you definitely hear that from speedrunners. And I will say it's one of those things where I got why people said it before, but the more you work, the more you realize how kind of a weird thing it is. Because most people don't, most companies don't design games for speedrunners. They design it for a larger audience. Because speedrunning is cool, but most speedrunners play games they like to begin with, not because it is a good speedrun. And then they start speedrunning it after. And trying to only accommodate speedrunners is a really, really small audience. And that means you don't make any money, and you have to, it's bad for companies generally to target speedrunners. So when you don't target speedrunners, you get like these really esoteric bugs that speedrunners will find. It's like, oh yeah, if you go ahead and blow yourself up by this wall, I guess I can actually use examples. In Oddworld Stranger's Wrath, you can get a little bat that you fire as a projectile and explodes, kind of like a grenade. And you can do a double jump with that. And with that double jump, you can do esoteric, kind of crazy, out-of-bound jump movements. And then once you figure out the right way to get on top of a building, you can do that to then get over the building, over a bunch of buildings, and skip the first section of the game. But you have to do it at a certain time where your character can't run. Like, it's just like this 10, 15-step process that is kind of a major break, but like took a significantly long time to discover. After discovering this extra bug where you can get a really small jump by holding spacebar while launching yourself up in the air. Like, it's just a mess. And it's one of those things where if somebody had ever said, I can't believe the devs let this in, my head would have just exploded. Because we spent like days looking for this, and it's a single player game with no online component. Like, nobody cares that we can do this outside of us and people that watch us play this game. Why would anybody ever spend more than like an hour looking for this?
Because it's their job.
Yeah. Yeah, that's whenever I hear people say, oh man, I can't believe QA didn't point this out or let this. QA always has pointed it out.
Yeah.
We all know.
Yeah. The amount of bugs I get back that are like, oh, waived or as intended, like a lot of the bugs I write are just for clarification, be like, hey, I noticed this is happening. Should that be happening? Because I don't know. I'm not the person that made it. But
I'll actually say production probably takes the blame for those bugs not getting fixed, because I'll get a bug and there'll be like 40 steps. And it's just like the repro rate is 5%, and this only affects this one console that doesn't exist anymore. Or like the PC was.
This is physically hurting me to hear you describe these situations.
Yeah. And it's just like, hey, yeah, we're not gonna spend like this engineer can either fix this other scary bug. It's like, oh yeah, the console doesn't work anymore after you play our game once, or like. Your save
by the way.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
Your save files get deleted or corrupted, which also happens a lot, or stuff like that. Or hey, let's do future content. That one also happens a lot.
No.
And so it's like, hey, we can fix this really, really weird, esoteric, scary bug, but like super, super hard to repro that we expect only people looking for it will find, or make something else.
Yeah, and I mean on that same note, it's like while that certain esoteric or absurd bugs get pointed out, at the same time, like we mentioned, we're usually on tight deadlines, and so most of the time, the reason that a bug like that doesn't get fixed, even though it seems once somebody finds it and it's out there, it seems like come on, how could you? Why wouldn't you fix this? This is so obviously bad. It's usually because the team is, during that time that they have allotted, is fixing the bugs that crash the console or that cause people's like social security number to get leaked or something that's absurd that shouldn't happen and is also like really, really bad. It's just a time thing. Like half the time those bugs get filed to see bugs, and it's like, yeah, maybe one day.
Yep.
I'll look at it.
Yeah, so most companies use Jira, which is just kind of a ticket organization system, and you see the C bugs just build up over time.
Yeah, C being like a middle tier bug. Crashes are considered like A, problems with physics are like B because the game still runs, etc.
Yeah, it's like, and then once you get to the C's of like, well, it's annoying, but it's not that common. It's like, oh, sorry about those C bugs.
Yeah, C is like, you have an NPC and their sprite like flickers every 30 frames. It's like, well, that's annoying, but we'll live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Back to the thing of like why QA doesn't catch things. Back to my original point of like things are built on top of what's already built. In the same vein, when you're testing, you have a testing schedule, obviously, and so you try and test something. Ideally, you only test something once. And so something is implemented, you test it, you test everything it interacts with, and then hopefully it's done. You never have to look at it again, theoretically. The unfortunate thing is that depending on how the game is built, those things, like I said, can come back and be broken later, which doesn't make any sense if you aren't the person that coded it because you're like, what? Why? I looked at it.
Every time an engineer says, "Oh, there's a quick fix," my hair just stands up, and it's just like, "Oh no, this is going to cause 1,000 bugs."
Lies my teacher told me.
Yeah.
If I had $1 for every time I came into work and sat down and content that I had done a year ago was suddenly bringing back bugs in Jira, I'd be a very rich person.
Yeah. It's a thing of just scale as well, which cost ends up being a huge deal for producers. Is how expensive is what you're doing, and are you staying under cost? But unless you had like $1 billion infinity dollars, you could never have a QA team that could ever match, a release audience. So it's like you have, I think I've worked with QA teams at varying sizes between like 8 and 200 people, and I would work with leads from those teams. And even at 200, it's like, well, if we make a content change that could affect the entire game, and there's only, let's say, a week to test it, they probably couldn't do that. So you end up just with the fact that like games development is very, very shaky in that way. Like a lot of things can go horribly wrong, and a lot of things can go horribly wrong very quickly, and you just don't have the time to fix it, and you never have the team size to fix it. So I'm going to use some teams actually do some cool stuff. I was going to use WoW. I like using WoW as an example of a game, but not necessarily. I don't actually know anything about it, so everything I'm saying is probably wrong in terms of how they develop it. But my guess is they probably have a ridiculous amount of automation of just like bots that are playing through the game constantly and kind of repeating actions. But then they're not having a human go through is still scary, and that you can't replay all the content always, and stuff will break constantly because of that.
Yeah. Related to that, as far as like having bots test, that's also brought up whenever I bring up that I work in QA. Is like, well, can't a computer just automatically do that? And it's like, well, a computer can automatically tell you if like something entered into a field in a web document is wrong, but a computer can't tell you, hey, after viewing this animation and sitting here for 5 minutes, the character starts freaking out. Like a computer isn't going to scan for that. They're just going to see, did thing happen? Yes, move on. Versus a human can actually tell you, hey, this just doesn't look or feel quite right. So that's why humans will always be needed for testing video games, is because ultimately they still have to be used by humans.
Yeah, I mean, even if that character's animation is freaking out, I mean, it played the animation, right? So as far as the computer's concerned, good to go. Let's ship it.
So that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's when you're working with these magical systems of numbers that somehow create these ridiculous worlds that we're all working on, and then you're making those worlds using different programs that were made with different numbers, that I mean, something's going to go wrong. And it's usually funny.
A lot of times it's funny.
Yeah.
So actually, to use World of Warcraft as an example again, but this is actually as a player, they did a level squish a couple years ago, and what they did was the numbers had gotten ridiculous, so they condensed the game down to, for the first few levels, you have 1,000 HP, like levels 1 through like 90, instead of going to like 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. I think players were hitting near 1 million. At the latest expansion. And so they had to take every number in the game and adjust it for all of the older content. So this is like 5 expansions, I think, 5 or 6 expansions worth of content and the original 60 levels. This would lead to moments where like I'd play the game and something that had not been accounted for, like there was a random undead guard that was fighting a human guard, and they were just like at perpetual war, just random NPCs. In a Wrath of the Lich King area, and they would have a battle shout that gave you 200 attack power, which for Wrath of the Lich King was nothing. It was just like a small little boost. It quadrupled my damage when I was playing through the expansion pack again, and I started one-shotting enemy players. I started one-shotting random AIs. I was just one-shotting everything, and it was because this one number that was completely meaningless for any player would now take you to more than the end game, like to level 90 levels of damage instead of level 45 or 60 at the time. And it's just this thing of like, is the buff being applied? It was being applied correctly, and all the automated testing for all the number checking was not checking on this NPC that no player could ever actually fight with. And it's just like, game development is awesome, is what I'm trying to say. Nothing ever goes wrong.
It is awesome. And tying it kind of back into some speedrunning stuff, I think earlier Spike was doing an interview talking about, what do speedrunners want from developers in terms of what bugs get fixed and how that would affect a speedrun, and what should developers kind of look at if they don't want to make everyone who speedruns their game very upset. And I think a point that was raised, which is very true, is this something that a casual player can do really easily? If it is, it's gonna get fixed. It's at the end of the day, we would all love these ridiculous tricks and sequence breaks and stuff to stay in because it's entertaining for this entire subset and this very passionate subset of people. But at the same time, if it's something that, you know, a 10-year-old can do and then completely destroy his game, yeah, we're gonna have to fix it. Just because at the end of the day, it is a business and it is a, you know, kind of people's trust in you is dependent on you making games that don't crash and burn every 3 seconds.
Actually, I think Yacht Club had a pretty good example of that, where they work with the speedrunning community because they.
Oh, yes. So for some context, in the Shovel Knight campaign, the original campaign, there are enemies that spawn on the world map, like in Mario Brothers 3. At the original launch of the game, if you're, no matter what your in-game time was, these enemies were guaranteed to spawn and would block your path toward the later part of the game. And so it would just lead to constant minutes of pointless time loss. And so what the developers did was they input a system that checked your in-game time up to a certain point. And basically, if you had beat a certain amount of levels under a certain amount of time, these enemies would no longer spawn, so they would never get in your way. And they've tried to do that in every campaign since. So if there's anything in the game that you think, oh, hey, I wonder if this like works because of like speedrunning, the answer might be yes, at least as far as the map enemies go.
Have you ever run into a bug that was caused by the speedrun support for the map enemies?
Probably. I don't remember at the moment.
That was a curiosity question. I don't need you to like that. That's definitely a hard thing to recollect.
Yeah.
I imagine you've seen a lot of bugs, many places, many times.
Yeah, like for reference, like my bug count at Yacht Club is like over 5,000 at this point, and I've been there 2 years, and it's like okay, let me just and I'll still remember bugs that I wrote like 3 years ago when I was working remote, and be like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened, and then someone will bring up something that happened like a week ago, and I'm like, I didn't write that.
That's
Wait,
not real.
What do you mean my name is attached to this? Where am I?
What do you mean I've written 13 comments on this bug and thought about it clearly for days? No, I still think back to on Injustice 2, a really amazing bug was during the super moves that the characters can do. At one point there was a bug on the mobile version of the game where instead of the character that initiated the super move being the one doing the super move, for whatever reason it was always Gorilla Grodd doing the super move, which was really funny for people like Catwoman and Harley Quinn to see Gorilla Grodd in their place kind of riding a motorcycle or, you know, ordering hyenas to attack people. You get tons of stuff like that, and that's the fun stuff. Like, if I could, if that wasn't in every single super move in the game, I would have left that in.
Yeah.
But
there's always one, like a bug like that, where like, oh, I input a jump after doing an action, and my character just kept rising and went off screen.
For all time.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to be honest, bug triage meetings are kind of fun because you'll just go through every bug that QA reported and watch every video and just see, you know, what is this bug, what are they reporting, and what can we do about it? And it's really fun going through those videos and just seeing like funny broken things. Like broken's bad, but when it's just like, oh, this character's using the wrong animation, and so their arm stretch is like to be like 10 feet long for no reason. I'm like, all right, that's cool. We should keep that. We can't, but we should really keep it somehow.
Can we use it elsewhere?
How can we keep it? It's not a game dev meeting if at some point in the meeting somebody doesn't go, oh no, we know about that. Ignore it. I know it's really bad, but we know. We're gonna fix it. Probably. It's every meeting.
You see someone fall through the world and then keep falling and they get faster as they keep falling through the world and just repeatedly fall from the top of the screen to the bottom. Like just every time I've seen it like 5 times. Every time I'm so happy about it, everybody's just looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Our game is broken. It's like, yes, but it's funny, and that's all that matters.
Yeah. Do we want to open up Q&A soon, or?
I was about to suggest that. So we got 20 minutes. So if you got questions, you can ask questions, or we can just ramble for a while. We have a microphone.
Yeah. Come on up.
So during the Metroid run earlier today, they used a lot of what they called developer-intended shortcuts. Have you ever designed in shortcuts intentionally for speedrunners or other, more competitive gamers to use, and did they end up actually getting used for that purpose?
I guess I'll start. Yeah, 100%. That definitely there's definitely a difference between a sequence break that is using mechanics that maybe aren't 100% polished or glitches that exist in the game versus a shortcut, right? Because I mean, in a game that somebody's going to spend 20, 30, 40 plus hours on, you 100% want to give them tools that allow them to, when they're in that 30th hour, not have to do the same thing that they've been doing for the last 30 before, and especially in a game that requires backtracking. So you'll see it a lot in Metroidvania games, hey, I've been through this hall 600 times, but now I have the thing that lets me scoot across the screen really fast, and that's 100% because they want to cover stuff like that. Like in Darksiders, we eventually later in the game you have an ability that allows you to glide in Darksiders 3. So we would sprinkle in sort of the like tornado wind gusts throughout the levels, so that a level that you used to have to run along the edge of a cliff for 15 minutes before, now you could just kind of glide across using this thing, and that's totally intentional. Yeah.
Like, I actually see it a lot for the developers themselves, just to make life easier, kind of like you mentioned. And those will just kind of transition later on because we know people won't find them unless they're a developer themselves. Like, oh, if you enter this menu in this really weird time in this tutorial, you skip the tutorial, even though we don't want people to do that. But most people that will do that, we don't really care because it means they've got a good enough grip of the game that they don't need the tutorial to like cover very, very basic movements.
Well, as far as Shovel Knight goes, it's a linear 2D platformer. The levels can only really be played one way. But that said, every level is still gone through, even the levels, like the tutorial levels, and spots are sprinkled in, as Dylan said, for like spots where you can use an item you get later in the game to an advantage in an earlier stage of the game. And every level gets a pass at that, so like you still get those moments, but there's not necessarily shortcuts intended. Something that is cool, though, is there is a skip in the first level of the Shovel Knight and Plague of Shadows campaigns that speedrunners found. Essentially, there's a room here and a room way up here, but no room in between them. And if you do a certain set of movements, you actually hit a screen transition that moves you up into a different room, and you skip a couple rooms. And for a long time, the developers knew about that because we showed them that as soon as it was found. But they didn't fix it because nothing was breaking at the time. But then we kept getting support emails that people were getting stuck in this transition. And so the developers actually went back and coded in a way so it now seamlessly moves you. So they effectively programmed a way to make the skip faster and more consistent for speedrunners. But that's for the sake of, in case someone accidentally does this, they don't get stuck somewhere.
So actually, I can think of a remnant example off the top of my head, which is the tutorial. Normally, you run to person A, talk to them, run to person B, fight some monsters, and talk to a bunch of people. If you just run to the monsters you need to fight, you get a different dialogue choice from the first person you were supposed to talk to. And they're just like, wow, that was really cool. What are you doing and who are you and what's going on?
Yeah. Also, we know we have not spoken to you ever before.
Yeah,
so.
it's like, you came in and restored power to the facility even though you don't know how to do that. That's really weird. And it was a very cool moment where like I cracked up because we were routing out to see if it was even possible. And it's like, okay, they left in a little Easter egg or something small for us.
Yeah, you'll run into situations a lot where you'll build something out, and you'll be 4 months down the line, or you'll be right before you have to ship the game, and someone's like, hey, you can sequence break this really badly, and instead of completely reworking everything you've done already, because you just don't have the time, it's a lot easier to go in and do something like that, where it's like, well, we can check a bool, right, which is a true false. We can say, hey, have you talked to this person before at this point? No? Okay, well then this is now offered. It's so much easier, and it just allows us to cover our bases. Most people aren't going to see that. But the people that do will probably appreciate that we don't just completely destroy their run and have to make them restart. So
it saved 2 minutes. It's pretty nice.
There you go.
Thank
You're welcome.
All right. Any other questions?
So one of the things a lot of speedrunners kind of run into is, especially when it gets down to discussion of glitchless, is every now and then you'll run into things in games which they don't seem intended and they sequence break things, but they don't actually use any glitches. How often do these come up in discussion of game development, where you might have a major sequence break that doesn't break the game in any significant way, make it harder to run, or doesn't really glitch or anything, but would still still kind of do something that didn't seem it was fully intended for?
I think that depends on how you define what a bug is, and that's kind of developer intended glitches are always kind of messy, because you will sometimes find moments where people just forgot to put something somewhere, and you can do something impossible for something that skips a lot of the game for not really too much of an investment. And that tends to be, it's well, it's not a glitch, but we also don't want people to do it, so we're still going to consider it a bug. Like it's something we did not foresee in our development, so we write it down as a bug and we consider it a bug, is how I tend to approach it. In terms of keeping it, I think it comes down to the question of how does it affect the casual user. So if it is something that is accessible and easy to do, and we think, let's say, 1% of the users will hit it, and there's not really a problem, if it's skipping enough of the game, I would say, yeah, we'd fix it. If it's going to be like 0.001% and you skip a lot of the game, but your game's fine, like, I would not care.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's tough because like developer intent is a very strange concept because the only intent is that the thing works properly. And after a while, you will get a rhythm for like how a game should, like how your project should look and how things are not supposed to behave. Like if I can input an action, use an item, and that gives me my jump back in midair, that's not supposed to happen. But like an example from the Fallout series is that in one of the games, if you're falling from a great height and you quick save and then use the action quick load, you don't take any fall damage. And the debate is, well, is that a glitch? Technically, the answer is no, because you triggered a save and then you triggered a reload. And reloading always reloads everything, which means it's an entirely new game state, as far as my understanding goes.
Yes.
So that one is not a glitch, but...
And
yeah.
well, I would actually say, like, you showed me that bug, and the question is, well, how do you fix it? So you have to either make changes to the quick save, quick load system. You can't save an error, for example, which a lot of games end up doing. But the problem there is, my biggest concern hearing that is, well, if you make it so you take fall damage, for example, like that's the obvious fix. You keep the fall damage anyways. That means a player could very easily get themselves in a bad state, because if I'm just a casual player, I'm falling at quick save, it overwrote another quick save, I quick load, my character's gonna die infinite times, and that's just a really terrible player state to be in. So it's it's one of those things where the developer intentions end up being, like you said, to have a working game, and I would just say that is such a chaotic system to touch, and it's not really problematic.
Yeah.
It just leads to funny bugs.
Yeah.
Or funny speedruns.
I think that the first question in those situations that always gets asked is, how risky is this to fix? How many things does this touch, basically? If it's going to require kind of a rework from multiple departments, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, they'll just opt not to, especially if, like you're saying, it doesn't necessarily ruin the game state. We can find ways to kind of support those kind of out there instances. So in Darksiders 3, if you somehow end up at a boss fight that you're not supposed to get to unless you have this power up, but you somehow got there and nothing else broke up to that point, we'll just give you that power up. So you now have it as if you had done the sequence of events that would have gotten it for you. But now we can ensure that you have it so that more stuff doesn't continue to get broken. The most common thing that I see that results in these conversations is missing collision. So if they're not blocking, if the environment artists are not blocking a certain area that you wouldn't expect to be able to get to, but now you can get to it, if it gets you out of bounds, they're going to fix it. That's as simple as putting a new volume in that space and preventing people from going there anymore. But then on the flip side of that, that's very studio to studio. If you look at Halo 2, you can get up on top of buildings in a lot of the levels in Halo 2 and just kind of run infinitely because they didn't expect you to be up there. But they also, I think especially at that time in Bungie's history, they don't really care because it's kind of part of the game at that point. And it's sort of on you as the player to make that decision. Well, do I want to keep running and see if I'll die and permanently corrupt my save, or do I not care enough to do that? So it varies for each instance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So many speedrunners, by the way, thanks for doing this panel, guys. This is
Sure.
great.
Oh, no problem.
Many speedrunners are also software and game developers. And I'm curious what it is about speedrunning that goes so well with software and game development. What is it? What's that thing?
So, if you are in games, you are likely not being paid as much as you could be for an equivalent position at another company.
That's for sure.
And the reason you're at games is because you really like games. So to use an example is, if I was in tech in general, I'd be a project manager instead of producer, and the pay at Facebook would be much higher than at a generic game studio, like whichever one you pick from a hat, most likely. And if you're a speedrunner, it means you really, really like games a lot as well. And I think there's kind of a very good intersection where I would say a significant amount of game developers, I don't know if most is the right word, but I would not feel bad saying most, watch speedruns occasionally and like them. And then like a significant amount of people, like just at the office, will watch games and quick and just have it on their second monitor the entire time it's going on. So it's just, people working games work there because they really love games. And people working, or speedrunning really love games as well and really love showing it off. And it's just like a very perfect intersection.
Yeah, I think those people that kind of intersect on that Venn diagram are usually people who like to know how things work. So, they probably watch Mythbusters. They like to find things out. So as a developer, to make the thing, you need to kind of know how the thing is structured. And then to be a good speedrunner, you need to understand the thing that's been made more intimately than anybody else. And so those two things go together hand in hand a lot of the time. I think for developers, especially watching speedrunners, they kind of almost feel a kinship with them in that, hey, you're taking the time to like really understand and care about this thing that I worked on that I also care about. Hey, you're great, So I think they really go hand in hand, those two things, very often.
I think it's just we're nerds and we like tech. That's
much better said than what I just rambled on about.
It's just that tech hobbies tend to like intermingle between each other because it's like, well, okay, I'm into games, I'm into figuring out systems. Maybe I'll go mess with a synthesizer or something.
Right.
That's basically what it is. We're geeks. We like
to
geek
learn.
stuff.
We're curious. Yeah, for sure.
I like mine because I got to make a dig about gameplay.
It's very timely.
Yeah.
Well said.
Any more questions?
All right. I think we're good to wrap it up. Any closing statements, I guess? Thank y'all for being here would be mine. Yeah. I call dibs on it. You guys can't say that.
Oh, man. I don't know. I got nothing.
All right.
Play Shovel Knight.
That was really, really great. Yeah, play Shovel Knight. Play Remnant. Thanks.
All right. Thank y'all.
Thanks, guys.